Alright, so today we are going to do something different. We are going to upgrade a computer that we have already built together. If you remember, back from November to January, I was building our Obsidian 900D, which was my very first custom water cooling system. And even though it's only been 6 months, well, the war between Intel and AMD has produced a flurry of new processors, motherboard, and etc. So yes, even though this is a very expensive, back 6 months ago, top of the line computer, it is not anymore, and it's borderline obsolete. So yeah, we have some work to do. The Obsidian 900D is powered by a Maximus VIII Formula Edition, which is on its own merit an amazing motherboard, but still it is supported by a Z170 chipset, which is a little bit aged now. We are going to exchange it with the very impressive and unique Maximus IX Extreme Edition. Now you remember that 2 or 3 weeks ago I had made an in-depth and complete review on this very same channel, so if you have never heard about this board, you do have some homework to do. This comes with a Z270 chipset, so more PCI lanes and more USB ports, but most importantly, with its own tape-looking monoblock. And yes, one of the M.2 solid-state drive will be water-cooled. Processor-wise, I have opted with the i7 7700K, the highest performing processor on the Kaby Lake range. That should give me a 15 to 20% performance increase and already brings back the Obsidian 900D to better days. Before starting the upgrade, make sure that you have all the required components. That means some distilled water, some water cooling coolant, colored or not. In our case, we are going to use a pastel coolant from EKWB, a Phillips screwdriver with different heads if possible, an ATX 24-pin short plug. This will allow us to run the computer without powering the motherboard, a screw container, and a larger container to receive all the different liquids we are going to drain out of our loop. Now keep in mind, this is a messy process, so make sure to have a lot of space, a lot of absorbing materials, and a lot of time, because you cannot rush this. You have to make sure that everything is done properly so we do not damage any old or new components in the process. Alright, so without any further ado, let's dig right in. Just a quick word to say that this is a more advanced video, so I might not go in as much details on the easier steps, but instead I will be focusing on the more complex tasks ahead for our upgrade. This said, let's start. First things first, before doing anything else, we are going to short the ATX 24-pin so that we can activate the pump without the motherboard. In our next step, we are going to prepare our loop for its draining. I'm going to open the lower compartment of our build and get the draining tube out of it. I find it a little short, so I'm going to add an extension to it and place the other end of that tube in a container which will be receiving all the drained liquids. Next step is to open the O draining valve and power on our system. Make sure to power off the PSU as soon as most of the liquid has left the pump. If you keep the pump going without any liquids, it might actually burn. It is sometimes necessary to put on and off the PSU a few times to push whatever is left of the liquids out of the loop. But again, keep an eye on the pump and make sure there's always a little bit of water in there. The goal here is to drain most of the liquid out of the loop, but if there is a little bit left, as in our case, it is not a problem. We can carry on. Moving forward, here make sure to disconnect any kind of PSU/dongles/connectors which are attached to the motherboard or its components. And of course, do not forget to remove the RAM. Our next move is to disconnect all the existing tubing, so that could be a little messy. Make sure to place some absorbing papers underneath every connection that you will be working on. When it comes to the motherboard water block, there is still plenty of liquid in there, so you want to make sure to plug it shut. In the case some of the cooling liquid hits any of the electronic circuit, don't panic, simply remove it with some absorbing paper. In the next few steps, I am going to go ahead and remove the remaining tubings which still attach our motherboard to the rest of our build, but as well the video card, the CPU water block, and the CPU itself. To avoid any kind of damage to your CPU socket and its pins, it's always a good idea to put back the socket protector on. And after removing the 8 screws which still attach our motherboard to the chassis, we are simply going to take it away. Before going any further, we still have to plug off the 240mm radiator openings, which still carry a lot of liquid. Okay, awesome. Now it is time to move to our motherboard. The Maximus IX Extreme Edition from Asus comes with its own dedicated monoblock, and that makes it the only acceptable option for this upgrade. Alright, so we're going to start by putting on our Intel i7 7700K so-called KB leg CPU onto the motherboard. Make sure to follow the instructions on your screen and to go as slow as possible. It is very easy to bend or damage pins on the LGA 1151 socket. The monoblock installation is not as straightforward as I would like it to be, so I'm gonna try to go really slow. You have to make sure that you have all the small components which came with it, as well as some thermo paste. In your monoblock installation kit, you will have some dark and transparent adhesive rings. As much as possible, try to get the opening on your rings to match the screw opening on the motherboard. I'm going to start with the darker rings, but there's really not much to it, so for the next few steps, simply follow the instructions on your screen and take it slow. Alright, time to put on the thermo pads. In your installation kit you have 5 of those, and on your screen you can see where they are going to go. Simply remove the protecting film on both sides of each thermo pad and gently apply them onto the transistors and silicon chip on which they belong. As much as possible, try to avoid touching them directly and just touch the edges of it so that it keeps this slight stickiness it has to it. And note that you don't have any replacement pads, so yeah, go careful. The thermo paste. I'm putting as much as I feel comfortable with, but feel free to put a little more or a little less. And our next step is installation of the monoblock, finally. Remove its head protecting film and ever gently slide the monoblock under your motherboard's RGB shield and try to align its screw risers to the screw holes on your motherboard. Then delicately return it on its face, and we are going to secure it with 2 different sets of screws. The first set is 4 little screws which come with their own rubber rings. They're very easy to identify. Simply make sure to place them on the location shown on your screen. The next set of 4 screws is here to secure the backplate to its monoblock. Make sure that the rubber side faces the motherboard. When tightening the screws, finger tight is quite enough, but as much as possible try to apply the same kind of pressure on the 4 screws. Alright, last step, we have to connect our Aura cable on the RGB connector right here and our 5V/PWM cable right here. It's worth noting that there is a 12V sign on one side of our connector, and this is very important because it needs to match the arrow on the plug itself. If you miss that, you run the risk of damaging your motherboard or the monoblock itself. So yeah, major careful here. Alright, it is time now to put our motherboard in the chassis. First you might want to remove the previous motherboard I/O shield, which I did not remove until now, and put that one in its place. And the I/O shield is actually integrated on this motherboard, so that is really cool. Next, I am removing an extension fitting which is in the way of my CPU PSU cable. It is the right time to plug it in the motherboard now, whilst there's still no tubing in the way. Next, I'm going to secure the motherboard onto the chassis with its 8 screws. You know what I'm gonna say. Finger tight is quite enough. In order to install our M.2 solid-state drive, we first need to remove the chipset heat shield, and now we can see where both of them will go. The first one will be right next to the monoblock, and the second one right next to the motherboard chipset. We are going to secure this last one in place with its screw. And as far as the second M.2 solid-state drive stick goes, we first need to take a look at the monoblock M.2 solid-state drive water cooling extension. That was a long word. And here it is. The first thing we have to do is to remove the protecting films from both thermopads and gently place it, as is, directly onto the monoblock. And now we're going to secure it with the 4 provided screws, and it should solidly stay in place. Final step for M.2 solid-state drive installation, putting back in place and securing the chipset heat shield. Next step, we are simply going to reconnect all the different connectors and dongles that we need to operate the motherboard with this chassis. It shouldn't take you much time. In order, we need to take care of the USB 3, front panel connectors, the 2 second generation USB plugs, our 240mm radiator fans, our main chassis exhaust fan, our 480mm radiator 4 fans cable extension, our front panel audio jacks, and finally a couple of SATA cables. Alright, so this part is a little bit more technical. This is fittings and tube that I put together to connect our monoblock output to our 240mm radiator input. And really, here the design is up to you. This is what worked for me and my build, but if you're watching this video, you are probably an enthusiast, therefore you know what you want. Next step, I'm plugging my reservoir output to my monoblock input. The GPU installation is as easy as for the rest. Put back the video card in place and connect it back to the 480mm radiator. And from the video card input plug, we are going to connect to the 240mm radiator output plug. Alright, so something I left for the end is the pump PWM plug. On the previous build, it was connected on the higher end of the motherboard. On this particular motherboard, it is in its opposite, in the very bottom. So I have to move it from the higher cable hole to the lower cable hole, and I am going to plug it to a PWM plug right here. This is probably my favorite part of the build, seeing the water flowing for the very first time. And the very first thing we're going to do here is to put some absorbing paper on top and below the GPU card and fill the reservoir up to 75% fill about. Gravity should be doing its job, and you should see some bubbles coming up and the level of your reservoir water going down, but nothing really will move until you put on your power supply. And as soon as you do, you should see the water flushing and flowing straight into the loop. Make sure to shut down the power supply unit as soon as there is no more water in the reservoir, as you run the risk of running the pump empty. And we are going to repeat this exercise off and on until our loop is approximately 60% filled. And from now on, I am no longer going to use deionized water, but instead the pastel water coolant, which will guarantee the best heat dissipation and the deep blue colors that I want to give to my tubing system. Once our loop is filled and the reservoir can keep its own level, you can keep the power supply on and running. And if there is no obvious leaks at this level, then do not turn it off and just keep it going for some time. Do not be surprised if you see your water reservoir level going down a little bit. That's probably because the loop is evacuating the remaining pockets of air as it goes through its first few cycles. Alright, so here is a moment of truth. Keeping the power supply on and the pump running, we are going to leave our loop functioning for the next solid 24 hours and see if there's any leaks. 24 hours later. Alright, so now we're simply going to inspect our loop, and if there's nothing wrong with it, well, first, congratulations. And secondly, the next step is to put back in our RAM modules, plug back the video card to its PSU cable, and finally, remove the short from the ATX 24 pin and plug it in directly into the motherboard. And that's it. There's nothing else to do but to start this computer for its very first boot.